Hey class, welcome to the class wrap-up. Psychology Key Ideas. In this course, we covered the roots and history and methods of psychology, the biological basis of behavior in the mind, levels of consciousness, how we develop across the lifespan, how we sense the world around us and make sense of it via perception, how learning and memory are related and those factors that affect each, how we establish gender roles, what motivates us and how we experience emotion, how the presence of other people affect us, the role of personality, psychological disorders and how they are treated, and we did some samples of applied psychology, looking at therapy and IO psychology, and probably will give at least a shout out to forensic psychology. Chapter 1, History, Schools, Definition, Research. Well, what were some of the important milestones in psychology's early development? In the 4th century BCE, we had Aristotle theorized about learning and memory, motivation, emotion, perception, and personality. He didn't have our knowledge, but he asked the right questions. Then eventually we saw Wilhelm Wundt establish the first psychology laboratory at the University of Leipzig in Germany, seek to measure what he called the atoms of the mind. He added two key elements to enhance scientific nature of psychology. Elements included carefully measured observations and experiments. Psychological science is born, psychology's first schools of thought. We have Edward Bradford Titchener, relied on self-report data, encouraged introspection, reporting on sensations and other elements of experience in reaction to stimuli in the environment. He used these introspective reports to build a view of the mind structure. This early school of thought was called structuralism. Then we see William James over in America. He studied human thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and asked, what function might they serve? How might they have helped our ancestors survive? This functionalist school of thought was greatly influenced by Charles Darwin. Psychological science develops behaviorism and Freudian psychology. How did psychology continue to develop from the 1920s through today? We have behaviorism. Defined psychology as a scientific study of observable behavior without reference to any mental processes. They became a major force in psychology into the 60s. John B. Watson, classical conditioning, and B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning dismissed introspection. Watson and Rosalie Rayner conducted the famous Little Albert study where they taught little Albert to develop emotional fears of things that he did not previously have fear of. Then we look at Freud. So Freud emphasized ways unconscious thought processes and emotional responses to childhood experiences affect later behavior. Freudian psychology was a second major force until around the 1960s. So we have behaviorism and Freudian psychology being two major forces in America. That resulted in this third force, humanistic psychology. Humanistic psychology is a historically significant perspective that revived interest in the study of mental processes. Remember, the behaviorist was a strong force at the time, so we had to get back to the idea of looking at mental processes because the great movement at the time was the behaviorists who shunned away from those ideas of mental processes. So humanistic psychology brought it back. They focused on ways current environments nurture or limit growth potential and on the importance of having need for love and accepted, satisfied, led by Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. And of course, we have the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy, as we've talked about several times already. The contemporary psychology, the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution began in the 1960s and focused return to the interest in mental processes. Cognitive psychology continues to scientifically explore ways in which information is perceived, processed, and remembered, and to study the cognitive roots of psychological disorders. The interdisciplinary field of cognitive neuroscience ties the science of mind, cognitive psychology, and the science of the brain, neuroscience, and focuses on brain activity underlying mental activity. Psychology science develops. Modern definition of psychology. Well, we look at this. Psychology today is the science of behavior and mental processes, combining the two major movements of our past, mental processes and then behavior, into one perspective. Psychology, the science of behavior and mental processes. Now, one of the key things that drives us is the scientific method, where we construct our theories. The example we provide is this. Let's say we have a belief that getting enough sleep, boosts your memory. So that's sort of like our theoretical underpinning. Sleep boosts memory. So from this theory, it leads us to develop a study to do something about it. We develop a hypothesis. When sleep deprived, people remember less from the day before. So we want to figure out some way to test that out. So that leads to us coming up with some way to do some research and conduct observations. Example, give study material to a people before an ample night's sleep or a shortened night's sleep, then we test their memory. Once we test their memory, we can see whether or not we can confirm or need to reject the theory that sleep boosts memory. If the results are the people who got a good night's sleep, they're the ones who remembered more than the people who got a bad night's sleep, that tends to confirm our theory. If the results turned out differently, we may need to reject it or revise our theory somewhat. Now, part of this idea of experimentation is looking at certain types of variables. The independent and dependent variables. The independent variable in an experiment. This is the factor that is manipulated, the variable whose effect is being studied. We believe if we manipulate the independent variable, it will have an impact on, guess what? The dependent variable. So the dependent variable in an experiment is the factor that is measured, the variable that may change when the independent variable is manipulated. But we always got to watch out for these confounding variables in an experiment. So we watch out for confounding variables. This is a factor other than the independent variable that might produce an effect. If we're not prepared for it, then we can believe that maybe the IV has a certain impact on the DV that it really doesn't, because a confounding variable has slipped in there and is actually causing the change in the dependent variable. So we want to try to remove as many confounding variables or control them as much as possible. Breaking down an experiment. We've talked about this several times in class, the famous Albert Bandura Bobo doll study, where they had a population of nursery school aged children. Then they randomly assigned them either to a control group or an experimental group. Then they watch a video. One of the videos will show a non-aggressive adult model interacting with the Bobo doll. The other video will show an aggressive model where the adult is getting all medieval on Bobo. Then what they'll do later, they'll contrive a situation where the children become frustrated and then they have Bobo doll available to them. What they want to see now is how often will the children display aggressive behaviors. So they'll believe that the ones who saw the non-aggressive model will not display that many aggressive behaviors, whereas the ones that saw the aggressive model will. And that's the way the results tend to follow. That those who saw the aggressive model, then in turn, when the opportunity arose, were in turn aggressive themselves. Whereas the children who did not see the aggressive model, they were less aggressive. So in this case, we can compare the control group with the experimental group. Now let's look at the comparing research methods that we discussed so far in this class. We have the descriptive research method. The basic purpose there is to observe and record behavior. How is it conducted? We use case studies, naturalistic observations, or surveys. Is anything manipulated? No. Weaknesses? Well, there's no control of variables. Single cases may be misleading. Then we have the correlational method. The basic purpose here is to detect naturally occurring relationships to assess how well one variable predicts another. How is this done? Well, we collect data on two or more variables and there is no manipulation. The weakness, well, we cannot specify cause and effect. When we have correlational data, we cannot say that one of these variables causes the others. We don't have enough information. Then we have the experimental research method. The basic purpose here is to explore cause and effect. How do we conduct this? Well, we manipulate one or more factors and we use random assignment. So we randomly assign them to groups, so the groups are basically equivalent to each other. Then we manipulate a factor one way in one group and another way in another group. What is manipulated is going to be that independent variable, that variable that we think has some influence on the thing that we're measuring, the dependent variable. Weaknesses. Sometimes conducting an experimental study is not going to be feasible. Results may not always generalize to other contexts, and sometimes it's not going to be ethical to manipulate certain types of variables. Chapter 2 and 3, Neuron, Brain, Consciousness, Sensation, Perception, Senses. Okay, neural and hormonal systems. Why are psychologists concerned with human biology? Well, simply put, everything psychological, every idea, every mood, every urge is biological. Biological psychologists study the links between biology and behavior. And as we discussed previously, the building block of our nervous system is the neuron, with its dendrites, its cell body, its axon, sometimes covered with the myelin sheath, and those terminal branches of the axon at the end that will release neurotransmitter that will go across that gap called the synapse to the dendrites of adjacent neurons. Then we looked at technology in the brain. Well, we know now that with new technology like PET scans and MRIs, we can see what's going on in the brain as people are doing or performing certain types of activities. Now, we also want to understand what the brain is structured like. Remember, we have that old brain, the brain that developed first in our particular species. We have the brain stem, which controls such things necessary for survival, including the things like the medulla, where our breathing and heartbeat are under control. The thalamus, which is a sensory control center, everything that comes in from the outside stimulus of the world goes usually to the thalamus, and then from there it's sent on to the appropriate area of the brain. We also have the reticular formation, which filters stimuli and also where we have our level of arousal. We have the cerebellum, which is where we have voluntary coordinated movement, balance, and as well as nonverbal learning. The limbic system, where we have the amygdala, which centers on our emotion, the hypothalamus, which monitors our eating and drinking and maintains our temperature, and the hippocampus, greatly related to our memory. When we talk about the brain normally, we talk about the new brain, the cerebral cortex, where we have the frontal lobes, the parietal lobes, the occipital lobes, and the temporal lobes. The frontal lobes is where we have our control of speaking, muscle movements, and making plans and judgments. And remember, the frontal lobes is the last lobe to sort of develop in the growing human body. That's why sometimes teenagers do not make the best judgments, because their frontal lobes have not fully developed yet. Then we have the parietal lobes, receive sensory input for touch and body position. The occipital lobes receive information from the visual fields, and then temporal lobes, which process our auditory information. Other characteristics are going to be association areas. Remember Phineas Gage, who had his frontal lobe damage. Also remember the terms of plasticity or neurogenesis. Remember there was an example in one of the videos where a young girl had half her brain removed, but yet was able to walk out within 2 weeks. And then of course the split brain individuals, where we sever the corpus callosum, which is the place where the left and right hemispheres of the brain communicate. If we sever that corpus callosum, what happens is those two brains, the left and right hemispheres, no longer communicate with each other. And therefore you have two independent brains in one skull. Now, let's talk about altered states of consciousness. What is consciousness? Remember, consciousness is your state of awareness of yourself and your environment. Some states change spontaneously: daydreaming, drowsiness, dreaming. Some are physiologically induced: hallucinations, orgasm, food or oxygen starvation. And some are psychologically induced: sensory deprivation, going through hypnosis, or putting yourself into a meditative state. Basic concepts of sensation and perception. What are sensation and perception? What do we mean by bottom-up or top-down processing? Sensation and perception are actually parts of one continuous process. Sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. Perception is the process of organizing and interpreting sensory information, enabling us to recognize meaningful objects and events. Bottom-up processing is sensory analysis that begins at the entry level with information flowing from the sensory receptors to the brain. We're constructing it. Top-down processing is information processing guided by higher level mental processes, as when we construct perceptions by filtering information through our experience and expectations. So when we are looking for something specific, we may more easily perceive it because that is our expectation. Summarizing the senses. Sensory system: vision. The source of vision is going to be light waves striking the eye. The receptors are going to be the rods and cones in the retina. The key brain area, the occipital lobe, processes the sensations that we get so that we can actually perceive it, make sense of what it is. Hearing. The source of hearing are sound waves striking the outer ear. The receptors are in the cochlear hair cells in the inner ear, and we send the information to the temporal lobes for processing. Touch. The source is going to come from pressure, warmth, and cold on our skin. Receptors, most of the skin, detect pressure, warmth, cold, and pain. It goes to the somatosensory cortex so it can be processed. Taste. Chemical molecules in the mouth. Basic tongue receptors for sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and savory, or umami. And it goes to the frontal temporal lobe border where it can be processed. Chapter 7, 12, and 13, operant conditioning, social psychology, and personality. Okay, operant conditioning terms. We have positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, we add a desirable stimulus. The examples are: pet a dog that comes when you call it, pay the person who paints your house. Negative reinforcement, remove an aversive stimulus. Take painkillers to end pain. Fasten seatbelt to end loud beeping. So, with negative reinforcement, we must remove something that is aversive to us. And whatever led to us removing that aversive stuff, we'll do more in the future. With positive reinforcement, we add something that we like, a desirable stimulus. Now, let's look at decreasing behavior, or punishments. A positive punishment, we administer an aversive stimuli. Spray water on a barking dog. Get a traffic ticket for speeding. Negative punishment, withdraw a rewarding stimulus. Take away a misbehaving teen's driving privileges. Revoke a library card for non-payment of fines. Social psychology. What is social psychology? It's how people think about others, how we influence people, how we relate to people. We look at attribution, where we try to determine the causes of behavior. We can say the behavior is caused either because of the situation, external factors, or because of the person, personal characteristics of that individual. People in a Western culture like ours in the United States, we commit an error called the fundamental attribution error, or FAE. That means we tend to overemphasize the personal factors as causes of behavior and underemphasize the situational or external causes. So culture does have an influence on how it is that we do attribution. For example, we have FAE in our Western cultures, but in other cultures, like in Japan or China, they're going to be a lot less likely to suffer from this fundamental attribution error. Then we have persuasion. How do we persuade individuals? How do we change their attitudes or beliefs? One way is called the central route of persuasion, where we use logic and rationale to try to convince people to become persuaded to one course of events or some cause. Or we can have a peripheral route of persuasion, where we try to go around logic and rationality just by using emotional appeals. This goes back to the term that I'm sure I mentioned before, is winning the hearts and minds of people. When you hear that phrase, winning the hearts and mind, the hearts is represented by peripheral routes of persuasion, and the mind is represented by the central routes of persuasion. Then we looked at studying roles. Roles are things that we play. Okay, actors play a role. You may play a role. The idea is that roles, once we begin to play them in certain ways, we can start to live that role and can become part of this. The idea, you may have heard of method acting before. This is where an actor, let's say this actor is going to play a homeless individual in a few months. So what they do is they go live on the street as a homeless person for 3 weeks. Okay, living totally as a homeless person, not going to work, not going to a job, just being totally homeless there, the whole 9 yards. The idea is they're trying to live that particular character that they're going to play, that role they're going to be in. The idea is that what some research has demonstrated is that when you are playing a role, the role sometimes can sort of play you. It will change our views of things. The Zimbardo study, Philip Zimbardo, who did the Stanford prison studies, is an example of that, where individuals, college-stage individuals, applied to participate in a research study. They were going to either be a prisoner guard or a prisoner, and it was supposed to last for 2 weeks. They did make a movie about this particular research study. They had to stop the study only after a few days because it got out of hand. The prison guards were too sadistic, and the prisoners were too unruly, and it just got out of hand. Cognitive dissonance. The idea is that when you have conflicting attitudes, or when your behavior and your attitudes are not aligned with one another, it can sometimes cause cognitive dissonance, sort of a tension within the organism or you. And the idea is that something has to change in order for that tension, that dissonance, to be released. Behavior can change attitudes when conflict between attitudes or attitudes and behaviors. The notion here with cognitive dissonance is this. Once you have something, let's say a behavior and an attitude are at odds, they're totally opposite one another, what's going to change, the behavior or the attitude? Normally, the attitude is what's going to change. Because if you're doing a behavior, there could be other factors that are supporting you to continue to do that behavior because they're being reinforced. Behavior that is being reinforced will continue. Therefore, your attitudes will adjust to fit your behaviors. Other items, the role of culture. We see social pressures such as conformity and obedience. Conformity is when you conform to a group standard. And we know that even when we disagree with the group standard, there's going to be pressure put on us to conform. The reasons for that conformity could be simply you want to be liked by that group, or you may believe that group may have more information. Then we have obedience. When someone tells you to do something, do you do it or not? Well, Stanley Milgram wanted to do a study on obedience. This was shortly after World War II, when we had the atrocities of the Nazi regime come out as that war ended, and we knew that it started in Germany, and people wanted to know, was there something going on with the German people at that time? But people suspected, and they were correct, the German people are no more different than any other group of people, because what they were able to uncover with the Stanley Milgram studies is that yes, we are very obedient when it is legitimate authority. The idea is that we can obey even when we are going to be told or required to hurt someone who is innocent. Other ideas from this particular chapter on social psychology, we have the presence of others has an influence on us. For example, we have social facilitation. The presence of others can facilitate our behavior upward, meaning we perform better, or degrade our performance when others are around. If we know the task really well, our performance usually goes up. If we don't know the task really that well, our performance usually goes down when other people are present. Then we have the ideas of social loafing. Social loafing is when we are in a group project, for example, and we don't put forth the full amount of effort individually on that particular project because other people can carry our weight. De-individuation. When we're in a large group of people, we tend to lose our sense of self-awareness to an extent. We become less aware of ourselves. We become more anonymous, smaller in a sense. And we're then more open to group commands in a sense. For example, when someone picks up something and throws it through a department store window and you're in a large group, you're more likely to participate in such activities because of this thing called de-individuation. We have groupthink and group polarization. Antisocial relations such as prejudice and discrimination and aggression. Prejudice are your attitudes based on stereotypes about groups where you prejudge them. You don't know the individual, but this person belongs to a particular group, therefore you prejudge them. Okay? If you behave differently toward them, then you are discriminating against them. Personality at a glance. What is personality? Okay, personality is going to be that consistent and somewhat stable way that you think, feel, and behave across a variety of situations and across time. We see psychodynamic theory of Freud, where he talks about the unconscious being having a great deal of influence on the conscious mind, and that these unconscious motives and conflicts is what's going to cause issues in the future potentially, since these issues have not been dealt with. Now, Freud's therapeutic approach and his theory of psychoanalysis, he uses certain techniques to try to get at the unconscious factors in a person's mind, using free association, hypnosis, and dream analysis. Freud's view of the personality structure is divided up into the id, the ego, and the superego. The id basically are basic drives and desires and needs and wants. The superego, when we internalize the rules and morals of society. And the ego, that's us trying to manage the world around us, as well as trying to control and mediate between the id and the superego. He also came up with the psychosexual stages of development that sort of talks about how it is that we go through a variety of stages as we develop our personality. Oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital stages. And of course, it's the phallic stage where he has that controversial Oedipus complex. He also brought up the idea of defense mechanisms where we protect the ego. Neo-Freudians that came after Freud, Sigmund Freud, such as Adler, Horney, and Jung, they all agree with certain aspects of Freud's work, but not with others. For example, they shied away from a lot of focus on sex, of which Sigmund Freud did focus on, and they went into different routes and focused on different areas of personality, for example. Projective tests are tests used to assess personality, okay, or things going on unconsciously with a person. The ink blot or the TAT test are examples of that. Looking back at Freud, well, we have a lifelong development. Freud believed that our development sort of ends at around 7 or 8 years old. By that time, our personality is fully formed. He thought that there was a great deal more influence from your parents, but now we know that there's greater peer influence than previously thought during Freud's era. And why we still talk about Freud? Well, unconsciousness is something in a vast area that we still look at. We do have an irrational nature, and there is some important aspect of human sexuality that Freud did highlight for us a long, long time ago. So the current view of repression, something that's very rare, humanistic movement, reaction to behaviors and psychodynamic, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a rank order of needs that some basic needs need to be met before the higher order needs are going to be met. Rogers' person-centered perspective, such things as unconditional positive regard, acceptance of people as they are, traits, patterns of behaving and feeling. The role of biology, we see the brain activity, neurotransmitters, reactive nervous system all play a role. These biological factors play a role in our personality. Looking at introversion versus extroversion, MMPI. And of course, the big five personality factors: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, and extroversion. These are the five factors that people started to see constantly as they did years and years of personality research, and these became known as the big five. Chapter 14 and 15, Psychological Disorders and Therapies. How should we draw the line between normality and disorder? According to psychologists and psychiatrists, psychological disorders are marked by a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior. Such thoughts or emotions or behaviors are dysfunctional or maladaptive, and they interfere with normal day-to-day life. Or the person is stressed out and having some distress because of these particular issues. In previous therapy, people used to think that the individuals who displayed odd, unusual behaviors were simply possessed. They would do a lot of things like beat them to try to beat the evil spirits out of them, or drill a hole in their head to let the evil spirits be able to escape. It wasn't until the medical model came up that we started to see things differently. By the 1800s, the search began for physical causes of mental disorders and for curative treatments. With the medical model, mental disorders, mental illness is to be diagnosed on the basis of symptoms and treated through therapy, often in a psychiatric hospital. So we have biological, psychological, and social cultural influences on a variety of psychological disorders. Therapies at a glance. We have operant conditioning, aversive conditioning, token economies, cognitive therapies, CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, group therapy, family therapy, self-help groups, and we also look at the effectiveness of therapies. The idea is that normally when people go through some issue and there's some sort of psychological distress, they may get better on their own. It may take a little bit longer, it may take some time. But the research does indicate if you do go get help, you tend to recover faster and you're less prone to having relapses. We'll stop there.